All right. Well, welcome everyone. Looks like people are starting to come in. We're going to get started in just 1 minute, so I'm going to mute myself and I will be right back to get things started. Thanks so much for joining us. There we go. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started because we've got a lot to cover. I think people are still kind of making their way in, but that's okay. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. We are recording this. You will get a copy in your email. We'll also make my slides available. If you want to find that, keep an eye out for the email tomorrow with the link and the recording and the slides. We will take questions at the end, so type your questions in the Q&A if you have them as you want to. I'll stick around at the end, but we do have a good bit of content, so I want to kind of get moving right away. So our topic today is quantifying the impact of remote workers. My name is Paul Shurin. I'm an economist with Impact Data Source, and let's see here. Let's first talk about kind of how we ended up here with this topic. We've had a good number of our Impact Dashboard users reach out with questions about how to model companies with remote workers or how to model the impact of attracting those remote workers. And so our focus today is going to be on how remote workers affect the real nuts and bolts of economic development impact modeling. And so for the benefit of anyone who is on this webinar that doesn't use Impact Dashboard, I'm going to take just 1 minute and review kind of what Impact Dashboard does, so we're all kind of speaking the same language. So we've got some screenshots here from our app, Impact Dashboard. Impact Dashboard helps you understand what the project will do for the economy and then translate it into additional revenues and costs for different levels of government. And so here, this is a partial screenshot from Impact Dashboard. The right-hand side is kind of noting some of those economic effects. The graph illustrates the fiscal net benefits, in this case for the city. The net benefits that we're talking about here are really, got it kind of summarized here. They're really just those additional taxes and other revenues that the community or the city might get from a project, minus costs that might be associated with the project as well, boiling that down to a net number to identify what that's going to be over a period of time. And so this framework allows us to model economic development incentives and calculate a rate of return against those net benefits. So the greater the net benefit, the greater the return of the project shows. So that's the big picture idea of kind of wrapping a lot of different pieces of impact modeling together, the economic impact, the fiscal impact, and then those incentives. So again, this webinar that today is coming from our perspective as economic consultants specializing in economic impact analysis for economic development. So we'll generalize as much as we can here, but in a lot of cases, it's going to boil down to the project or community specifics as you get into it. So overall, for our kind of approach in general is going to be understanding the remote work trends, consider the implications, and then illustrate how this affects the type of economic development impact modeling that you do in Impact Dashboard. Just another kind of thing to hit on here in terms of helping everyone understand our perspective as we present this information today is to kind of just talk about our company. So Impact Data Source is an economic consulting company based in Austin, Texas. It was started by my partner, Jerry Walker, in 1993. As a company, we have about 25 years of experience or more doing these types of studies. When I say these types of studies, we're helping EDOs or governments throughout the US evaluate prospective projects or incentive deals. We also developed and support the web-based impact model Impact Dashboard, which we talked about just a moment ago. And that software enables economic developers to evaluate projects just like impact data source economists. One more little thing before we get rolling. This fun fact about Impact Data Source is 100% remote. We all work from home or for wherever we happen to be at the time. 3 of us are normally in Austin. A couple of our developers live a little bit further north, but still kind of in central Texas. And then many of you know Nicole, I'll call her out. She's out in California in the East Bay. And we've got some dots there. In the past, we've had employees in New York and Michigan and DFW area and San Diego. So kind of all over managing things remotely, but maybe on a smaller scale than a lot of these other companies we might be talking about today. So here is our agenda as we're getting into it. We're going to look at some remote work trends before, during, and after COVID-19. So kind of talking about this topic, I wanted to get clear on what was happening and to what degree things are happening. And then we're going to look at how this affects the way we model projects. And so first, we're going to look at modeling a business where some of the workers will be remote. And then second, we're going to look at the idea of attracting those remote workers to our community. So there's kind of both sides of this that we're going to be looking at. Now, I want to get to our first interactive part here on the webinar. We've got a question. I want to take a poll and see what everyone thinks. If we can pull that up and put that in front of everyone. The first question there. What effect will an increase in remote work by private businesses have on your economic development efforts? And so, let's see. Nicole, are we showing that? There we go. Cool. So you should be seeing the poll, and we can think about this. So again, we're talking about specifically in your community or your specific economic development efforts. That's kind of the way we're thinking of this. I'm going to leave it up for a little bit longer, but if you can kind of lock in those choices, we're thinking, is it positive, negative? Is it kind of neutral? It won't really have a positive or negative effect, or maybe you just don't know. And maybe that's why you're on the webinar. And so we've got a good number of people that have locked it in already. Let's go ahead and show those results, Nicole, if you can. All right. So we got the poll results there, 35% positive, 14% negative, 12% neutral, and then 39% uncertain. So that's interesting. Let's see. I had no idea what people were going to say. We have a related question. So let me grab these numbers and then we'll show the related question. So for the next question I want to ask, and we're only doing 2, so don't get too tired of the polling stuff. Next question I want to talk about specifically economic development across the board. So first one, I wanted you to think about your community, but what effect will an increase in remote work by private businesses have on economic development generally? So in this case, we're not just thinking about your community, how you might be affected, but maybe across the board for everyone. And we can kind of leave this up for a few minutes or a minute here and see what people say, if there's a difference maybe, or if everybody kind of thinks it'll be the same maybe as what they thought was going to be the case in their specific community, see if it's any different. Let it go just a little bit longer here. We've got a good number of people responding, so that's nice to see. All right, we can show those results. It looks like you should be able to see them soon here. So this is actually pretty consistent. I guess we don't know if everybody said the exact same response in both cases. The only difference I see there was maybe the same number of positive there was 35%. The number of people saying uncertain dropped from 39%, I think, to 35%. Unless I wrote that number wrong. But Yeah, so kind of a mixed bag, it sounds like to me. I think a lot of people are thinking it's going to be positive, but a lot of people don't know. And so that's interesting context for as we get going today. So let's take that down. I think we've taken it down. I'm going to jump into kind of the rest of the things here. So we're going to talk about remote work, kind of the state of remote work before COVID-19. So this is an article, it's actually a pretty good article, the Pew Research. You look at the date, it's March 20th of 2020. So kind of just right at the very beginning of things in terms of when things were shutting down and really kind of coming to terms with the pandemic. So they're saying in the articles, before coronavirus, telework was an optional benefit, mostly for the affluent few. The article and the source are pretty good on this, but I pulled some charts specifically from the sources that they were talking about. So we'll take a look at them. So this first one is just touching on what percent of workers work from home as of, prior to the pandemic here. So this is going back, it's using data from the American Community Survey. And we can go all the way back to 2010 through 2019. Basically, it goes from 4% to 5%. So 5.2% in 2019, the share of workers working from home part of the time, at least part of the time, right? So, I mean, initially that sounds kind of small to me. I mean, I knew it was small, but that might help you put things in perspective a little bit more. Just thinking about where we're coming from. Next up, we have a different source. So this one's from the BLS. So this is the National Compensation Survey. The question here is more about, do you have the access to a flexible workplace benefit? So this is the idea that you might not have to do all of your work in the office. So this is the access to a flexible workplace benefit. And we broke this one out because, as they mentioned in the Pew article, that it was kind of more available to the affluent. If we look at this across the board, all workers in orange there, we're showing about 7% had that benefit. And that really hadn't changed a whole lot. That one goes all the way back to 2010. This survey is taken in March, so the 2020 numbers are probably still representative of pre-pandemic. But if we look up those that make the most money, the highest 25% of average wages, is about 18% have that availability of a flexible workplace. And then we can see at the lower level or the lower income quartiles there, it's much below the average. They're 1% or 4% for those. If we break that out by occupation, we can see, the types of occupations that are more likely to have that benefit. It kind of is what you might expect. Management, professional and related occupations have that availability at 18%. Sales and office occupations, 7%. Again, 7% was the average across the entire group here. And then service occupations, production, transportation, material moving, natural resources, that's 1 or 2% have that available to them. So that also makes sense with what you kind of assume about things. If we hit next here, we've got the same information, again, this idea of available of a flexible access to a flexible workplace, but this one is by industry. So insurance carriers kind of are the highest percentage there of most likely being able to work remotely. Then professional, scientific, technical services, finance, and different things would be a pretty high percentage of those with that benefit. And on the other opposite side, retail, trade, transportation, utilities, construction, healthcare, those sorts of occupations are showing a much lower opportunity to work kind of remotely or have a flexible workplace. One of the things I'll kind of clarify here up front, because it's a little fuzzy, especially as you get into the details of a particular project, maybe. When we talk about the data that we're looking at here, so the first survey that showed 5.2%, that's the American Community Survey. That data actually comes from a commuting question where they ask how you usually get to work. And one of the options of actually commuting is just, oh, I don't commute, I work from home. And then usually we can assume maybe is more than 50% of the time. So the BLS survey, as I mentioned, it kind of asks the question as a quality of life benefit and whether or not a flexible workplace is available to you. And this benefit permits workers to work an agreed upon portion of their work schedule at home or at some other approved location. So again, they're not saying really to what degree someone can work remotely. So as I think about this, the definition is not clear cut. When you see a lot of these surveys, you see a lot of the data, they rarely make this distinction to whether you're working from home a couple days a week or you're never going into an office, right? So that, in my mind, is a huge difference between someone who works from home a couple days a week versus someone who doesn't even have an office to go into, for example. So again, I haven't found reliable statistics that break down that sometimes remote versus 100% remote. I suppose if you've seen good statistics on that, send them my way. I'd be interested to see kind of how small that 100% remote portion might be out of this broader definition that seems to include both types. So we think about now moving toward this idea of remote work during COVID-19. There's honestly, these surveys are kind of out there everywhere. This one is actually like pretty prominent if you're searching around, and it actually looks very nice and put together. It's the State of Remote Work 2020. It's put together by Owl Labs in collaboration with Global Workplace Analytics. If you get into it or just Google Owl Labs, they are a video conferencing technology company, so a little bit of a remote work cheerleader there. And so the kind of the takeaways or the main takeaways that they have on their survey were essentially that 70% of their respondents were working from home during the pandemic. They were happier, more productive. They were actually working more than usual, and they want to work remotely after the pandemic. And some of them would be interested in moving if they were able to work remotely. So that, I mean, take it for what it's worth in terms of the source and so forth. But I think these are things that, at least to some degree, people would agree with about what's happening during COVID-19 as people are getting kind of the forced to work remotely and getting a taste of working from home a little bit more than prior to this. Another survey that maybe is a little bit better source, I think, is this PwC survey. They actually it's kind of a follow-up survey. They did a survey in June of last year, so June of 2020, and then again earlier this month, so like literally January 12th, they show. And so they're asking not just employees, but they're asking the employers, so CEOs and so forth. So in that first chart on the left, we're looking at has remote work been successful? Employers, actually a higher percentage of employers are saying it's been successful than employees. That's a little interesting to see. And then on the right-hand side, kind of getting their responses in terms of if their productivity has improved. Again, employers kind of seeing things more positive than maybe even the employees. These two charts are actually somewhat confusing as you look at them. So take them in there one at a time here. So this one is thinking about executives. The question on the left is asked of executives if they need to have employees in the office to keep the company culture. And in order to maintain that company culture, most CEOs are saying they need to be in the office. And so, at least 3 days a week, they're saying 29% said that, 4 days or 5 days a week. So we have a pretty big chunk that are saying that they need to be in the office. Only a small percentage of respondents said that employees don't need to be in the office to maintain a company culture. Now, kind of on the flip side of that, not necessarily being in the office, but actually working remotely. So half of the employees want to work remotely 3 days a week or more is what this one's saying on the right-hand side. So you've got a little bit of a mix here between maybe they're going to meet somewhere in the middle again, where there's this flexible, maybe 3 days a week type of thing. But you can see that employers are not expecting them to be 100% remote. And that's the one that folks want the most there, of being remote 5 days a week at the 29% response. This PwC survey also talked about kind of new investments CEOs were planning and so forth. So a lot of technology things here, of course, virtual collaboration, IT infrastructure security kind of things. And so that's what's on the minds there in terms of thinking about, the future investments and so forth, or what the new offices might look like. And then kind of staying on that trend with the idea of offices and real estate. On the left-hand side, we're kind of just talking about, they're asking, what do you think you're going to be doing in terms of your real estate needs? And some folks are thinking they're going to consolidate into a premier business district location. Others are thinking of opening more locations and satellite offices in suburbs, that kind of thing. So again, to me, it's a mixed bag a little bit as you read all of those. On the right-hand side, you get a little bit more of the mixed bag or mixed response. You see the question about, do you need more space or less space in the future? A lot of people, one of the things folks were expecting was a reduction in commercial real estate, or lack of demand, so to speak. And this is showing again that maybe 56% are indicating it, that they want to increase the amount of space they'll need, and then 31% would be to reduce it. So that again is kind of pointing to this, it depends type of response. So transitioning now to kind of what's the future here in terms of the remote work after COVID-19. And for this, I'm referencing this McKinsey study, which is actually pretty interesting. Their punchline is more than 20% of the workforce could work remotely 3 to 5 days a week as effectively as working from an office. And that would be 3 to 4 times as many people working from home than before the pandemic. So 20%, 3 to 4 times, that's kind of lining up with the numbers that we saw in the ACS survey that we started this with. Now this survey, the report that McKinsey put out, the purpose there was they were looking at individual tasks performed by specific occupations and how, to what degree could those be done remotely or outside of the office. And they kind of ranked them and identified, how much of that job could be done remotely and sort of thing. And this list, so this is their kind of some of their results. This looks very similar to what we had seen kind of prior to the pandemic in terms of the ones that would be most likely to be able to work remotely versus those ones that would be least likely to work remotely. So this is kind of lining up with what we might have expected from the pre-pandemic times. The types of occupations and tasks haven't changed that much through that time period. One thing they point out, which I think is really important, is this: more than half of the workforce, however, has little or no opportunity for remote work. And so this, risks accentuating inequalities at a social level. So as kind of, we've had a lot of different trends or kind of themes going on over the last year or so, remote work being one of them, and also inequality. And so these two are kind of coming together here on this one as well. Just kind of mentioning a couple other downsides of kind of remote work, thinking about this. Working from home can be lonely. I can tell you from experience with Impact Data Source and employees that not everybody wants to work remotely and be on their own and kind of not have a lot of interaction. Some people really want to have an office and have an interaction and that sort of thing. Communication and collaboration can be a challenge. It can be challenging to build remote company culture. And then, of course, during COVID-19, there's been additional stress, of course, with workers maybe having multiple family members working or learning from home, and just kind of, it never stops kind of problems. So what are the remote trend takeaways here that I think will inform some of what we talk about next as we think about modeling this? So remote work will be more prevalent in the future, possibly 20% of the workforce. That's 3 to 4 times more people working remotely than pre-pandemic. The most likely to work remotely include occupations in management and professional, or industries such as finance, insurance, management, professional services, and so on. Those least likely to work remotely, obviously, these are not, again, things that should be surprising. Occupations among natural resources, construction, production, so forth, and then specific industries, retail, trade, transportation, utilities, and so on. So now we're going to start talking about this idea of modeling the impact of businesses with remote workers. So business response to COVID-19. So many businesses, especially in professional services, technology, and management, will allow workers to work remotely at least a few days a week, maybe 100%. But businesses still need real estate. So we want to think about the types, how a new project where they're going to have some remote workers might differ from the traditional project that you might be familiar with evaluating, right? So I'm going to look at some headlines here just to kind of even show in these headlines some of the mixed messages even that we saw in some of those surveys. So we'll go through a couple of these and then get back to modeling here. So there's a couple of Facebook ones in here, but we've got on May 21st last year, Facebook had a big announcement. They were going to say they could have 50% of their staff on remote work by 2030. At the same time, they were mentioning that they were going to have remote or kind of hubs in Dallas, Denver, and Atlanta, kind of smaller offices footprint. Right. So that's what Facebook was thinking about again in May there. And then by August, Facebook doubles down on work from office with a massive New York City lease. So kind of they're definitely not planning to go remote immediately, obviously. And then Dropbox is another one, kind of, it's not the largest company, but again, it's one of the ones that maybe is showing what the future will look like. And the headline here says that they're going to make remote work permanent, but they're also, in the story, they talk about Dropbox Studios, which essentially would be smaller office hubs comparable to what they were kind of describing in the Facebook articles as well. So maybe a smaller footprint, kind of popping up in the locations where their employees end up living and that sort of thing. And so almost more like a co-working space, it almost sounds like. And I think a lot of people saw this headline or this story last year with REI, the outdoor retailer, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, deciding to bail on their new headquarters that they had been in the middle of constructing, based on kind of how well remote work was going. So it was, you could see it's quite the headquarters they were building, or they built, and they won't even occupy it. Pinterest, they bailed on a lease that they had committed to, and it was so expensive they had to pay $90 million just to terminate that lease in this new building. Again, kind of based on what had happened in the previous few months there, they decided to change some plans around their real estate needs, and even willing to put up millions of dollars to get out of the lease. And then just to check in on that REI headquarters, we've got Facebook coming in and actually buying that headquarters in Washington. So it's again, Facebook's kind of all over this thing. For me, as I kind of summarize some of this, as I think about what types of projects or how this is going to change projects in the future, tech and other firms, I guess, are embracing remote work, but they still need real estate. And so I see things happening in terms of a change in spending. So they're spending differently on real estate, maybe less, maybe just differently if it's depending on what it is. They might spend more on technology, as we kind of touched on, to help or facilitate some of the remote work from home stuff. The other thing to think about will be that the workers may not be in the office every day, and so that for say a larger city, they're going to have less daytime population and spending, right? So you've got central business districts where there's a lot of restaurants and different things that serve that daytime population, and that may be changing a little bit in the downtown makeup. And so again, maybe you want to have a Starbucks on every corner, but maybe just every other corner in that case. So we're going to do a headquarters project, and we're going to do an example kind of comparing a typical headquarters and then kind of this remote style headquarters that we'll kind of make up. And just to illustrate some of this, the differences in what you would be seeing, what you would be entering in these two types of cases. So on a typical headquarters, they'll have their traditional real estate needs for office activities, typical kind of office layout and cubicles and so forth. And of course, everyone's coming into the office every day, right? That's the way that work works, right? Everybody has to come into the office, and that's where they work. In this remote style headquarters that we're going to be kind of making up as we go along, we're going to assume that it needs a little bit smaller office. So there's going to be fewer dedicated desks, more focus on meeting rooms and hoteling spots. Obviously more technology to support the on-site and remote activities, that balance. And then in terms of the workers, some people are still going to have to come in every day. Some might only be on site 3 times a week or so. And then even some of them might just be 100% remote. And so they're not necessarily going to be tied to that office specifically. So just to kind of talk through some of this as we're kind of trying to understand how all of this is coming together in the model, I want to do a quick economic impact refresher, and it all starts with spending. So the typical case, we're thinking about what does that company, the headquarters office, what are they spending their money on? And so in that case, the company's spending, it represents the direct activity. when they do that spending, they're purchasing things from suppliers and so forth. We're capturing an indirect impact. That's the local suppliers that are providing services or goods to the direct company. And then we have the induced impact, which would be when the workers are spending their money at local businesses. So if I kind of just pulled this together, a little bit of a pie chart to think about, to put some actual percentages to this to help you kind of visualize it a little bit. When you think about a headquarters and they're spending money in your community, a big chunk of that, as we see the big blue section, is basically the wages and compensation that they pay to their workers. Almost 60% of what they might spend their money on would be that. Some of it would be for other professional business services. Again, this is a headquarters specifically. If we were to do this maybe in a different type of project for manufacturing, these spending patterns might be different. After compensation to workers, after professional business services, you've got real estate there at 10% of the spending, then finance and insurance, information, and then some other things are smaller and smaller amounts. If I kind of in the next chart, I'm going to kind of remove the compensation to workers and just think about what the company is spending money on to their suppliers, excluding workers, right? So if we exclude the compensation paid to workers, and we think about these percentages, and we can see what that looks like here. It's comparable to that last pie chart, but slightly different, as we can imagine. So that's the big idea here. The headquarters are spending money, and that's supporting some activity in the community, right? So this is the indirect economic impact when we just focus on the company spending money at its business suppliers, not the wages paid to workers. So a company spending less on, say, real estate and more on technology will likely reduce the impact of the company in your community. So real estate is going to be locally supplied. So if you're spending less on that, that's not going to be good for your local spending. And then technology, again, in most cases is imported. So that would represent kind of a leakage if they're buying technology from some company outside of the region. And so that spending isn't going to be captured in the local community. So the more a company in general, the more a company spends within your local economy, the larger the impact will be. And this is the indirect economic impact, the company spending money at local suppliers. When less money is spent locally, the indirect economic impact will be lower. Okay, so just to kind of do a crude graphic on this one, we've got the typical headquarters project with local supplier spending. We've got these big, bold, green dollar signs, lots of them going out to various things. They're buying their utilities, information, real estate, professional services, all that stuff, right? This is the typical case. If you think about maybe in the case of a remote style headquarters project, those big dollar signs turn into smaller dollar signs, and not as bold, not as many. And so essentially what's happening here in the remote style headquarters projects, they're spending less money locally. That's the company itself for their suppliers. So that's going to have an impact for us, obviously coming through in this indirect impact being smaller. Now, on the induced side, this is the workers spending their money. So a company that employs remote workers will likely reduce the impact of the company in your community. So workers typically spend their earnings close to where they live. So the more workers that live and respend their earnings within the local economy, that'll have a larger impact. This is the induced economic impact of workers spending money at local businesses. When fewer workers reside in the local economy, the induced economic impact will be lower. So we can do another crude graphic for this one. We've got the headquarters project paying the workers. So a bunch of money going out to the workers. And this is the typical case. Those workers are going to kind of respend some of their money here in our local economy. And we've got big dollar signs going to all the different places a worker might spend their money, and maybe even more that aren't on there. And then we go to the remote style headquarters, and we got smaller dollar signs, fewer dollar signs. Essentially, we're spending less money locally here as there's fewer workers maybe in the area. And it's going to just boil down to less money being spent throughout that local economy. So that at a kind of a high level concept is what's going on as we think about maybe this remote style headquarters project as I've described it. So this chart is just kind of showing the darker orange is showing the indirect impact by industry, and then the induced portion is kind of showing the the worker impact spending by industry, and impact, I should say. So you can see, for example, like professional scientific services, we've got a big dark orange indirect impact. For example, healthcare, we've got a large induced portion impact. So that's just kind of taking some of that information that we talked about and kind of showing how it comes together when we actually have a headquarters project and we're modeling it here, looking at their spending. So now we're gonna try to put this into an example in Impact Dashboard. So this first case, this is the typical version. So we've got a recruitment project. It's professional and financial services industry. The NAICS code there, we've got the headquarters office. We're looking at 35,000 square feet of office because we've got 100 jobs. I got that timeline. They're going to be investing $7.5 million, and they have annual payroll for these workers of $12.5 million. So that's the typical case. If we want to see, again, for my made up remote style project, we're going to do it a little differently. So we're going to have a little bit smaller office footprint. So instead of 35,000, it's maybe only 26,000 square feet. So the capital investment is going to be a little bit smaller because they are investing kind of in a smaller facility. We're identifying 75 new jobs as opposed to 100 in the other one. If we look at the hiring details down below, in this case, we've got the company telling us maybe that 50 of the workers will work on site 5 days a week, the 25 workers will work 3 times a week, and then 25 will be fully remote, right? And so if that's the case, we can kind of, forget the 25 that are fully remote if they're not really coming into the office, having an impact there locally. Assuming they don't live in the area, we could get more details on that perhaps, but we're just going to give them credit, quote unquote, for 75 jobs. So that means their annual payroll impact is going to be a little bit smaller than the full typical project. So I'm going to jump over to Impact Dashboard now just to kind of show what that looks like. So here's our typical project. So this is what we just looked at for the full case where it's 100 workers all coming into the office. So it's a $12.5 million payroll. If we go to I'm just going to look at the summary report for our purposes today. We've got the direct impact of 100 jobs. We had some spin-off. We get 158 here at the city. And we can see our direct workers' salaries. The average across all of the workers is about 100,000 still. Capital investment of 75 million. Looking at our benefits, costs, and net benefits from this project, we've got about $733,000. We can get into the details. This is kind of where the specifics of a particular community come in, but in this case, it's a Texas client. They've got some sales taxes, property taxes, all that you can see. But ultimately, we can see the impact, and this is over 10 years, $733,000 from a typical headquarters project. I'm going to try to pull up a side-by-side and show maybe what this looks like for the 2 different instances. If we go to this might be a little tricky for everyone who's familiar with this. You might not always look at it side by side, but on the left-hand side, we've got the typical case. It's the $733,000 in net benefits. On the right-hand side, we've got that remote style project, and that is where again, we only have the 75 direct workers. So our total job count is a little bit less than the full one. So 118 jobs versus 158. We can look at our salaries. The average salary across all of these workers is going to be a little bit lower as well. The capital investment, as we mentioned, this building difference as well. The building is only going to be $5 million in this case. So on the net benefits basis, we're looking at $520,000 compared to the $733,000. Again, these are our net benefits particular to the city over the 10-year period, just captured by reflecting the fact that maybe those workers might not all be in the community having an impact, and that activity at the facility might not be as intense as it otherwise would be. Let's jump back to our slides. So this is kind of wrapping up for the business side, so looking at businesses with remote workers. Some takeaways for me would be to clarify if the workers will be coming into the office and how frequently. So try to understand to what degree those workers will be local. That's maybe always a concern of trying to understand where the workers are coming from or what the footprint of this is. But in particular, when you have the possibility that workers are fully remote, you want to really understand that. And so we already have some clients that that kind of implement this maybe for other reasons, but consider requiring employee address / zip code list to get an understanding of, if they told you it's 100 employees, let's make sure that they're not all living on a remote island somewhere, right? The other thing I would kind of remind you to think about as you're maybe talking to a company that it has this remote element to it, or maybe just as a trend into the future, understand that capital investment may be less. And it might be worthwhile to consider calculating taxable property per worker to compare to the current, amount of property that you have in the community per worker as you think about these projects in the future. It could be that that's going to be going down over time and can help explain some of these differences that you might see in taxable property. Let's see here. So now I'm going to kind of switch over and start talking about modeling impact of attracting remote workers. And we're gonna kind of summarize here a little bit. Some workers may not visit the office every day, may choose to live farther away. So if they don't have to drive, if the commute isn't necessarily every day, they might just choose to live a little bit further away because they don't need to be so close to work because they're not going there 5 days a week. And if some workers are 100% remote, they may, obviously they can work from anywhere. Again, for this topic or for this part of things, I wanted to kind of get some context. So I'm going to show a few mobility statistics, then we're going to talk about remote worker attraction programs. Saw this headline. This was, I guess, October. Vast migration of over 14 million Americans coming due to rise in remote work, study shows. So this was a survey. I don't know. So they said 14 to 23 million Americans are planning to relocate to a new city due to this acceptance of remote work. I was kind of curious if that was a big number, or if that was a small number, or like what over time period that was going to be. And so I got bogged down in looking up some information on mobility. And so if you look at US annual migration, and this is looking at it from 2019 to 2020, we can see that 9.3% of the population moved residences. So like moved from one house to another house, wherever it is, right? So that's 30 million, approximately 30 million people. So 5.4% moved within the county, 2% moved within their state, only 1.3% moved out of state. So I mean, it's still 4.23 million people. That's, I guess, a lot. And a small portion moved from abroad. And then we have, just as kind of putting a point on this, 91% didn't move. So 291 million people didn't move from 2019 to 2020. So again, kind of driving that number home, just kind of putting these in perspective. 30 million people moved of any type, whether within county, within state, out of state, but 290 million didn't move. If we just focus in on those that moved, 59% of those just moved within the county. So, that's not in most cases what we're thinking about as remote workers kind of relocating and that sort of thing. Within state, that may happen that may be part of what we're talking about, and then out of state, and then from abroad. So we can kind of see how that breaks out. If we look at this trend over time, this goes back to 1947. It was like 20% of these migration rates. Now it's 9.3. We can see that it's kind of steadily declined over time. So fewer people are moving compared to previous years, as we see there. The other thing that I wanted to kind of dig into for myself was why people were moving. And so I've kind of categorized these, or actually they've categorized these from different groups. And so you can see for different reasons, like family reasons or employment reasons or housing reasons, why people are choosing to move. The biggest number there is in that housing category. They just wanted a newer, better, larger house or apartment. And that's over 4 million of the people that moved are choosing that one. If I go to the next slide, we kind of collapse that down a little bit. And so the family related reasons are second to the housing related reasons as we think of this. So the housing and family related reasons are probably, reasonable expectations for these remote workers, why they might be wanting to move, so they can kind of work wherever they want. So now they can maybe move to a place with cheaper housing, or maybe they move back close to extended family and that sort of thing. This is a U-Haul study that they, or a study, or a U-Haul listing that they put out like last week or the week before, showing kind of the top locations. If you look at the top three, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida, no state income tax. So that's kind of what you would expect. You hear a lot of people talking about moving to Texas and moving to Florida in the news for sure. Tennessee, of course, in there as well. If you go to the opposite end of this, so the ones that are the ones that people are least likely to move to, I suppose. You can see California. That's kind of what you would expect just from paying attention to the news. Illinois, New Jersey, Massachusetts, some of these states that at least the headline would be, or the big thing is that they seem to have a higher tax burden. And so those are showing as least likely to be moved to. And as I was kind of thinking through all of this, I wanted to get some context around remote worker attraction programs. So I looked at a couple, and we'll kind of go through these if you're interested in them. I've got links so you can kind of jump out and review some of those. So this state of Vermont one, this was one I was kind of familiar with, at least in my head, that I had heard of before. So I went out and checked it out. They actually started back in 2018. So obviously before the pandemic, this wasn't just trying to capitalize on last year, let's say. They offer up to $5,000 grant, cost of relocating as an incentive to live and work in the state. Their goal is to increase population of taxpayers, school enrollment, and strengthen the employment base. They kind of talk about that in some of their materials. They're funding that, they put in a total of $500,000 per year, and so it's up to $5,000 per grantee. Last year, or I should say in 2019 at least, they had 140 grantees, and that led to 298 residents. So that includes, spouse maybe and children perhaps, but 140 grantees specifically. The Vermont, just to me, I was like, okay, 298, that's almost 300 people. That sounds like a lot, but Vermont population is about 600,000 people. If we go, we've got a couple other, not at the state level, but more region or city based. So the Northwest Arkansas Council, they're kind of putting out $1 million to invest over 6 months to attract top talent to the region through the Life Works Here initiative. They're offering up to $10,000 cash incentive to move to the region. They are trying to highlight their bike trails and other things. They would also throw in a bike. So that was kind of cool. I might be able to get, if they let me choose my bike, it might be more than the 10,000 cash incentive, but we'll see. They might have a limit on the upper end there. Savannah, Georgia, they have a program. They have, the funds are capped at 50 households or $100,000 a year, up to $2,000 to reimbursement for moving expenses. And so they have a program that's interesting. Startup Tucson, this one is kind of a whole package. So they say it's valued at over $7,000. It includes just $1,500 cash for the relocation, but then it includes kind of a package of other things, including a coworker sampler pack and free internet and so forth. So it's kind of a cool one. Definitely more focused on the tech community, I suppose. And this one, they're really trying to get you kind of into the community because they're paired with a community ambassador. So they're trying to really kind of help you assimilate into the new home there. The Shoals, Alabama, that was $10,000 paid out in installments over 1 year. They make that one had, the other ones might have an income requirement. I'm not 100% sure. I won't say for certain, but in the Shoals, they were very clear that you needed to make at least over $52,000 a year there to qualify in that case. Tulsa Remote, another one where it's $10,000 paid out over the first year, kind of in installments. They do like a monthly stipend for part of it. They actually give you some free desk space. They mentioned that there were 375 members in 2020. That sounded like a lot, especially compared to Vermont, but I'm not sure how they were counting that. Again, that one's launched back in 2018. Then Choose Topeka. This one, I'll be honest, was one of the more confusing ones for me in terms of trying to understand from their website. But they were going to give you funds if you were renting a place, or even more money if you were going to buy a home in Topeka, and trying to get people to move there. So just in kind of me reading the tea leaves, so to speak, here of these remote worker attraction programs, looks like they're trying to attract high earning workers, maybe diversify the economy, or boost the workforce in the community. Presumably the spouse comes along, if there's a spouse, and maybe they can work locally, even though the initial person is working remotely, who knows. Maybe they're trying to develop that knowledge worker sector and benefit from future business creation. In Vermont's case, they kind of come out and say this, talking about trying to stabilize declining population and kind of have more people paying into those fixed costs of government and education, if they can spread that out over more residents. Certainly, there are probably other goals of remote worker attraction programs, but I did not put all of them down. So the economic impact associated with attracting remote workers. So let's kind of put this back into our framework as we think about it. So a new worker household will generate economic benefits through their local spending. So typical ED project, again, comparing it to kind of that old standard project we might be thinking about, they're going to have an economic impact generated by the company spending. That's the indirect impact. So as the company spends money in the community, as they're having a presence, and then they're also going to have the worker spending, that induced impact. So again, compared to a typical ED project, the economic impact of the new remote workers will be lower, because we're missing out on all of the company spending that would be typically associated with an employer in your community. So this is kind of, again, just an example. We're looking at an employment multiplier, so a direct effect employment multiplier this is Cook County, Illinois. For custom computer programming, it's about 2.39. We can see how that breaks out. The total impact of 2.39 includes both, or all of this, the direct, the indirect, and the induced impact. So the direct impact is 1, the indirect in this case is 0.62, and the induced is 0.77. Okay, so that's the typical case. But for a remote worker, the direct is still going to be 1, right? There's still 1 direct worker, right? The indirect, as we just mentioned, is probably going to be 0, because really the company isn't spending money in your community. The indirect, you're losing out on that indirect part. And then the induced part, we can think that might be less than typical. So in the typical case, you would have the induced worker spending representative of both the direct and indirect effects, but now our indirect effects are 0. So it's going to be pared back, we think, most likely. They may spend differently. So these remote workers, they may spend differently than typical households if they're buying maybe some business services, quote unquote, like co-working space or tax consultants. So maybe in some way, through that induced spending, technically it's coming through and representing some of the typical indirect activity you would think of. But I think generally speaking, you can assume that you can't use the same multiplier, right? So don't try to use the 2.39 to represent this impact of your new remote worker that's a programmer, right? So I think a detailed approach to estimate the impact would be done if we looked at the household expenditures of the remote workers. So it's going to be dependent on the earnings, and you can also consider whether or not you kind of include the impact or the earnings from a working spouse. So if they're like in the Vermont case, we saw 140 grantees and 298 households. Are the spouses and so forth, are they working as well? Should we include that in our impact? So I think in kind of working through this a little bit on a few examples, I think the economic impact will most likely be modest, right? So the employment multiplier that we're going to be thinking about is not going to be the 1 point, or it's not going to be the 2.4 or the, even maybe 1.8, right? I think realistically it's going to be in the 1.1 to 1.25 range. And again, it depends on the earnings, it depends on the region, it depends on other factors. And I will say, obviously, this kind of is just looking at that direct or that worker coming in. So it neglects the upside that you get from creating a tech ecosystem, and it connects entrepreneurs and workers and generates this whole other industry maybe, or strengthens industries in your community. So there's a possibility for that. So maybe that's part of what's coming in here, and that would be that would be great, but we're not going to model that, or that's a little bit even more difficult to model, I would say, than what we're talking about here. So that was the economic impact. So if we think about fiscal impact of trying to think of what are the revenues and costs associated with new remote workers in your community. So obviously the big one might be residential property tax. As you get into that, are we thinking about, are they building new residential properties, or are they just occupying existing ones? And so do we give them, quote, credit for paying those property taxes on the house that's already been there? Is it really a net new tax? I mean, you can look at it a couple different ways. In terms of sales taxes, that would be something, if you have a local sales tax, that might be a benefit for you. I would be curious to see the household spending compared to existing residents, right? So if these are remote workers that are moving to Florida because they want that tax domicile of no income tax, but then they spend maybe 5 months of the year somewhere else, they might not be spending exactly like an existing resident. Income tax, as I just mentioned, we could talk about this at the state level or even at the local level. Are you able to capture this is kind of a good question. I would say governments at all levels are playing catch up on this idea of people that are living in your community, making money, but they're getting their paycheck from somewhere else, not specifically in your state. So that could be, again, something that you're playing catch up on, although it does represent revenue if you can get it. And then there can be other things, just like the utilities and charges and fees in your community. So as the population increases, it's reasonable to assume that other government revenues may increase accordingly. So there's going to be some other fees that we can expect to kind of come along with this. On the cost side, same kind of thing. So as the population increases, it's reasonable to assume the cost to provide services to residents will increase. And so maybe just kind of a marginal increase. You may not necessarily hit big fixed costs and so forth. But there would be costs, I expect. And then the cost of education, new residents, if they have school-age children, they might be presenting new costs to the school system. As I kind of summarize here a little bit, economic impact may be modest but positive. The fiscal impact could be mixed, right? So new residents are going to bring revenues and impose costs for local governments. The way this shakes out in any community is going to be dependent on the current government capacity. That's the way I think about it anyway. So cities that are experiencing growth may ultimately hit fixed costs that require additional investments beyond the new revenues generated just by these new remote workers, for example. Cities that are losing population, and so they may have excess capacity in their ability to provide services, and new residents can be served with minimal incremental costs, and they're spreading out some of those fixed costs across a larger tax base. And so, I think, again, the Vermont attraction program is kind of in that, the kind of the lower bullet point that we're looking at there. Let me go into Impact Dashboard again here. We'll do a different example now looking at remote workers. We're gonna try to think of this in a cohort of 10 jobs, right? Or excuse me, 100 jobs. So let's see if we can attract 100 remote workers over the next 5 years, maybe 20 jobs a year. We're gonna assume they make $85,000 a year, and we're gonna consider a $10,000 grant per job and wonder if that kind of works out. One of the key factors, at least, that we're going to look at in this one is whether or not the workers build new homes, or maybe it's not necessarily build, but give them credit, quote unquote, for the taxes that are generated by the property there. So I'm going to switch over to our model again. I'm going to fix our Zoom. Sorry, go back to 100%. So I'm going to go out to my projects. We're going to pull up my remote workers. Got scenario 1. And as I mentioned, we're going to have 100 workers being phased in here. We're attracting them over 5 years, 20 jobs a year. We can see some of these benefits, costs and net benefits are getting pulled in. If I go to our summary report, that might be the best place to see things. So it's 100 direct jobs. We're picking up 20 spinoff. In my case, I put in 20 spinoff workers. The direct workers make an 85, spinoff workers make a little less. There's no capital investment in this one. So again, this is the case where it's remote workers coming in. And so there isn't really a business making an investment. And so there's no property taxes paid by the company, so to speak. On the residential impact side, again, it's 100 people are relocating to the area because it's all 100 of those workers, and 50, we're saying 50 new homes, right? Or we're giving them credit for 50% of those property taxes. If I can scroll down here, we can kind of see what's happening. We get a little bit on sales taxes and a little bit on or I guess a lot on residential property taxes. That's the main driver of this whole thing. Picking up some additional revenues here and costs. This one's specific to Texas, and this is, this is going to be different in every community. There's going to be different, sources of revenue, sources of costs, and ways you might want to look at it. This one, as we see, it's going to be generating $568,000 over 10 years. So this is the numbers over 10 years. If we go, we can kind of already start thinking about this. If it's $10,000 per job, I'm going to go over to our incentives here and plug in $10,000 per job. If we run those numbers on the 100 jobs, it's going to be $1 million in the total incentive that we're talking about. And if we look at our chart here, the typical chart, we've got, again, 568,000 of cumulative net benefits by year 10, but our net or our incentive was $1 million. So by year 10, we still haven't quite hit our payback point on it. We're doing our best to estimate it here. It goes out to 15 years in this case, if we were to look at it a little bit further. So in this particular case, based on these assumptions, that's kind of not showing the best return for a $10,000 job. Now, if you were to give them full credit for all of those workers building property or maybe paying the taxes on those homes, we can go from 50% to 100%. And we can take a look. In that case, we do get a little bit better payback. So we can see in this case that our net benefits are a little over $1 million by year 10. So it kind of takes us the better part of 10 years to hit our payback point. So in this case, that's the way we're looking at it here. So we can see those numbers again. You can think about some of these remote worker programs and think about, a lot of them were 10,000, some were 5,000, some were 2,000 per job. You might take a broader view maybe and say, well, what's it across all of the community, in terms of what's the county get and the school district and so on. And you might look at it that way. There's other ways to slice this for sure. And the amounts might not be that, but, one way to think about this is, it's kind of like if you were getting a company, but without the company spending, right? So you're getting some workers, but not the company itself with the property they might be supporting. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a repeat of the previous slide there. The bottom line to me, it depends. So it's going to really depend on some of the specifics of the program, specifics of your community, and the specifics of the type of workers that you're going to be getting in there. I think in general, those remote workers that you might be attracting are kind of ideal citizens, so to speak. So there are most likely good things that can come from it, but trying to get it to pencil out in terms of this type of analysis, it may not be necessarily as big of a slam dunk as you might hope or expect. I'm going to jump over and take some questions now. That was a lot that I got through in almost exactly an hour. So I'm going to see what we've got here. If anyone has questions, or I see some comments throughout that had come in. But feel free, if you do have questions, to type them into the Q&A part. Let me scroll up and read some of these questions in the chat. Or Nicole, if you can jump in and read some of these if I can't find them quick enough here.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, did you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, it looks like, what about impact related to outsourced marketing and other financial and professional services that headquarters use? Regardless of number of people, won't that still be about the same? I think that's true. So if we look at my crude graphic here, it was kind of maybe to make the point, it was maybe not as true as it should be. So for maybe, for example, certain expenditures that the headquarters would make in a typical case versus a remote case would not change, right? So maybe they're doing the same level of spending at finance and insurance. As in my graphic here, I'm kind of showing that all of these dollar signs are getting smaller across the board. That may not necessarily be the case. So that is accurate. But I think when you have certain aspects being affected, it's going to have this reduction in the overall impact across the board. You can get very, very specific if you want to dig into the details. Maybe it might be worthwhile of getting more details from the company if it's possible to understand what their spending will be, and then just run the analysis based on their actual spending and so forth. I will keep looking at our chat here to try to find questions. If, let's see here. So we've got a comment. This one's in Tampa, due to our low cost and high quality of life, we expect to be able to gain a lot of virtual workers. We have no way of knowing how many are moving in, how much they make, and what they do. Any ideas how to capture that impact? That's an interesting question. So, well, one of the things, and if you have if they have these attraction programs, you can actually kind of see how many people you gave an incentive to and understand some of the things that have that head count, know how much you put out. If it's just happening kind of organically, so to speak, that does become a little bit of a problem to try to understand, who those people are, how to, interact with them and so forth, and maybe support them. I'm not quite sure. I think that's a really good question. I think as we looked at a lot of the survey data that we saw of, like, do you work from home? Like, at least at the census level and that sort of thing, it's not going to be super useful of trying to identify those things right away. I would guess maybe there are things that you can do more similar to like the Chamber of Commerce type events, where you're trying to connect those new virtual workers who are new to the community or just in the community, and help them network or meet other people or become more part of the community, and give them a way and reason to get together, and maybe you can kind of get in touch with them and then understand the impact a little bit better there.
I also am going to jump in real quick, Paul, because we got a comment from someone else in response to that question, saying that many cities survey their residents on a biennial basis. And one question could be, do you work from home, or some variant of that, just to get an idea of, who's there, how many people are working from home, maybe try to figure out some of those data pieces.
Yeah. Let's see here. Yeah. I'm again still trying to read all these as I'm catching up. Jason Ford, so asking about big takeaway is that we need to make adjustments in the models ourselves on a case-by-case basis instead of mass update to the model. I think that's right. I mean, these are project-specific things. So you may get a company that comes in and they say, there aren't any. This is an old style, quote unquote, right? This is the typical type of project, as opposed to one that would have any element of remote workers. But I think it'd be an important thing to understand the details, right? So it's just a question you need to understand from the project perspective. And then if they bring up any of these wrinkles that we're talking about, of maybe some of the workers will be remote, or they won't even be in the region, or they'll live further away, then you will need to kind of address it at that point. But there are ways to do that, and we can certainly help you. Certainly the way the Impact Dashboard is set up is you can kind of conference us with anything you want to get in there and discuss. All right, Tanner, so you're asking about long-term impact of the models of direct versus in-person job creation as a result of remote workers. I do think, I mean, it'll probably be, realistically, I mean, the multiplier, the way that this all works through the information coming from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so those input-output tables that they generate, and this is the same information that RIMS2 uses, as well as pretty much everybody else, because it's the only source. So it's the input-output tables from the BEA. They're used by Implan, they're used by MC, they're used by RIMS2, right? Or I guess I shouldn't say MC, I assume they're used by MC. But that input-output data, that kind of serves as the understanding of how different businesses, or different industries, I should say, buy from different sectors. And so eventually, as we get further down the line, that will get baked into some of these multipliers. as we're dealing with it, even for the next, couple years, I would say there might be things that we need to do to think about, if this project is different than the typical, quote unquote, typical being, something that's happened in the past. We may need to make some adjustments to it. It just may take a little bit of more understanding about the particular project and so forth. So of what they're doing specifically, and if it doesn't match exactly what a traditional headquarters has done in the past or a traditional manufacturer has done in the past, you may just need to make some account for that in your analysis, and we can help you depending on what those specifics are. I'm not seeing any more questions. So I'm gonna, unless I missed one, Nicole, that you think I should address, if you had one that was further up that I didn't see. But I will kind of start wrapping this up, and thank everybody for attending here. As we mentioned, slides and the recording will be sent out in an email tomorrow. And thanks so much for joining us. And please reach out to me directly if you want to talk about maybe some specifics or a specific case one-on-one. Thanks so much.